2025. And it looks like that's the feeling it wants to tap into. It's being described as like a mix of horror and mystery and thriller. And, it's interesting. It's gotten a PG-13 rating. So in our deep dive today, we're going to look at what we know about The Woman in the Yard based on like the early buzz we're seeing, the basic idea, what critics are saying, and those first reactions from people who already seen it. What we really want to do is understand the main concept and how people feel about it out there.
So I guess the first thing is to lay the groundwork. Let's talk about the premise. What's the story? What's drawing people in, or maybe even kind of freaking them out a little?
Okay, so we start with this woman, Ramona. She's played by Danielle Deadwyler. And we learn that she's a widow. She's still dealing with a lot of grief because of a car accident that killed her husband and injured her too. And now, she has to take care of her 2 kids, a 14-year-old son and a 6-year-old daughter, all by herself. And they live in a farmhouse out in the country. That setting already starts to make you think about being isolated and maybe a little vulnerable. That's classic horror stuff.
Yeah, that rural setting, it's such a staple in these kinds of stories.
Right.
It like cuts the characters off from everyone else. They have to rely on themselves, and it just makes any threat feel so much bigger. Yeah. Even the silence can become this character in the story.
Exactly. And so you've got Ramona and her kids dealing with all of this. And then this woman shows up in their yard. At first, Ramona just thinks, maybe she's lost or confused. Maybe she's got some kind of memory problem. But as this woman keeps showing up, it doesn't go away and starts getting closer and closer to their house. Well, it becomes really clear that there's something way creepier going on. This woman's intentions. They don't seem good at all.
Well, it's that gradual buildup of tension. It goes from something that seems harmless to something really threatening. And then you've got Ramona, already weighed down by grief and all these responsibilities. And now she has to become this protector against something she doesn't even understand. It's like they've layered this personal vulnerability with this outside danger, something that might not even make sense.
It really does make Ramona the center of all of this. So what are critics saying about how all of this plays out? The early reviews, they're all over the place. It seems like people have a lot of different opinions.
Definitely a wide range. Right out of the gate, Megan Navarro from Bloody Disgusting, she didn't hold back at all. She called it this high-concept psychological horror movie, but she said it was so inert that it lacks anything resembling tension or scares. Oof, she gave it 1.5 out of 5 stars. That's rough.
Yeah, that's not great. But then Frank Scheck, over at The Hollywood Reporter, he saw something there. He felt like the movie had these considerable thematic ambitions and that it goes beyond just the title. Which I guess does sound kind of generic. He gave it credit for, trying something different in the horror genre, even though he didn't think it totally worked. So it seems like he liked that it tried to do something more, even if it didn't quite get there.
Yeah, that difference between what a movie's trying to do and how well it pulls it off, that's a big deal in how people react to it. And Hannah Strong, from Little White Lies, she seems to think the execution was the problem. She felt like there wasn't enough here to sustain even a slim sub-90-minute runtime. And she felt like the director, Sean Kalecera, like he was lost because there wasn't enough action or twists. She also gave it a pretty low score, 2 out of 5.
Sounds like some of these critics were hoping for a more straightforward horror movie. It's clear scares and a plot that moves along. Mark Dusick from Mark Reviews Movies, he kind of echoes that feeling. He said the movie plays so many games with what's real and what's otherworldly delusional that it's not grounded in anything apart from trying to confound us.
Yeah.
And he gave it a 1.5 out of 4. It's like this interesting idea that just doesn't come together for some people.
What's really interesting here, though, is that people see this ambiguity in different ways.
Yeah.
For Dusick, it was frustrating. Like, the movie was unmoored. But then Dan Beyer from Next Best Picture, he's more forgiving. He says the movie certainly isn't awful. And he really liked Danielle Deadwyler's performance. He called the movie an emotional character study about the inability to move on after tragedy. He gave it a 6 out of 10. So for him, Ramona's internal struggles were compelling, even if the scary parts weren't that strong.
That's a really good point. It's like maybe the movie is more about Ramona's emotional and psychological journey rather than just trying to scare you. And then there's Siddhant Adlakha from Mashable. He had this really memorable line, kind of a burn, actually. He said the movie, existing at all in its preposterous form, was a mystery unto itself, one far more interesting than what ends up on screen.
That's rough.
It sounds like he just didn't connect with the movie at a basic level.
Right. It sounds like this movie could be really divisive. Like it doesn't fit neatly into those horror movie boxes. So, from the critics, you're hearing that it's boring and not scary, that it has good ideas but doesn't quite make them work, that the story's too thin, that it's confusing and doesn't know what it wants to be, or that it's a decent character study with a strong lead performance. That's all over the map.
Yeah, it really sounds like people will react to this movie differently depending on what they want from a horror movie. Now, what about the early audience reactions? They can sometimes give us a different angle, something we weren't expecting.
Totally. And we are seeing different reactions here, too, though some people seem a lot more enthusiastic. Like EJR said it was a good movie with a deeper meaning. They even said there might be mental health references and that viewers need to be open to fully understand the movie. They gave it 4 out of 5 stars. That kind of reminds me of what Bayer was saying. Like, there's something more going on beneath the surface.
That is interesting. A deeper meaning and mental health references. It makes you think that maybe there's a subtext that some people are picking up on, even if the scares aren't the main thing. But then there's Trinity. They seem to have had a totally different experience. They thought it was a really good movie with a lot of jump scares. They even said it was definitely the best horror film to come out in a while. And they also gave it 4 out of 5 stars. So for Trinity, the jump scares were there and they worked. What do you think about that? Such different reactions.
It just goes to show you how differently people can experience a horror movie. What one person thinks is boring, another person might find really scary. It probably depends on how sensitive you are to different horror techniques and what you expect going in. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum, we have Jose. They just said, save your money, and gave it 1 out of 5 stars. No question about how they felt.
Nope, not at all. And then there's Wild 3XAT. They thought the movie was engaging. And they even compared it to Us, you know, that Jordan Peele movie.
Yeah.
It's a really well-respected psychological horror film. And they gave The Woman in the Yard 4 out of 5 stars. That's an interesting comparison. Us definitely played with unsettling ideas and that feeling of dread. So if The Woman in the Yard can do that for people, it must be doing something more than just cheap jump scares.
It is a really interesting comparison, especially if you like that kind of layered horror. And then there's Cherie. They said the movie was thrillingly and surprisingly different than any movie I've ever seen. They liked the acting from the mother and the kids and gave it 5 out of 5 stars. It seems like this surprisingly different aspect keeps coming up. Maybe it does mess with some of those horror tropes in ways that some people really like.
Yeah. Keeps coming back to this idea that the movie doesn't fit into one specific category, which could be good or bad, depending on what you like. And finally, Gage Lopez. They thought it was good for what it was, because it was PG-13. They said it was worth waiting to stream. But they also said it had an okay ending that left some questions on what was real and was fake, and still gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Questions about reality. That lines up with what some critics were saying about the movie, messing with those lines.
So from the early audience reactions, you've got everything. People thought it was scary and had good jump scares. People thought it was deeper and more psychological. And of course, people who just didn't like it at all. And the PG-13 rating. It seems like some people are factoring that in. How scary can it really be if it's PG-13?
Yeah, it definitely adds another thing to think about. A PG-13 horror movie can't really rely on gore and stuff. It has to use atmosphere and psychological stuff to get under your skin. Maybe that explains why people have such different reactions. So let's go over some of the basic facts we know about the movie.
Sure. So the director is Jaime Colosera. Danielle Deadweiler is Ramona. And the other actors are Okwi Okpakwasili, that's the woman in the yard. Russell Hornsby is Ramona's dead husband. And Peyton Jackson and Estella Cahiha are her kids.
Right. And like we said, it's listed as horror and mystery and thriller. And it's only an hour and 28 minutes long. It's kind of weird that some critics thought it was slow, even though it's pretty short. Maybe the pacing is off. Or they just didn't think there was enough story there.
That's a good point. Just because a movie is short doesn't mean it's good or exciting. And it's produced by Blumhouse Productions. They're known for making horror movies, especially those lower budget, high concept ones.
Which makes sense considering what we've heard about The Woman in the Yard and the PG-13 rating. Like we said, it has these content descriptors. Some violent content, brief, strong language, bloody images, suicide-related content, terror. So it's not super gory, but it's definitely still a horror movie.
And you know, sometimes you can get a better idea of what a movie is going to be like by looking at the more like this section. For this one, they suggest Imaginary, The Darkness, Sweetheart, Blumhouse's Truth or Dare, and Night Swim. It's a mix of supernatural horror and thrillers. And some of them are also PG-13. So that might give you an idea of what kind of horror experience The Woman in the Yard is going for.
So to sum it all up, we have a movie with a pretty classic horror setup. A grieving mother in an isolated place has to face this mysterious and threatening figure. The critics are split. Some people are disappointed because it wasn't scary enough or because the story wasn't strong enough. Others like the themes and the lead actress's performance.
Right, and the early reactions from the audience, it's the same story. Some people were scared and thought it was thought-provoking. Others were just bored. The fact that it's PG-13 and it's from Blumhouse, well, that probably makes people think it'll be a certain kind of movie. Whether it lives up to those expectations or not depends on what you like in your horror.
So our deep dive into The Woman in the Yard, it really shows that this is a movie with a lot going on. People are reacting to it in all kinds of ways. It seems like it's mixing psychological stuff with maybe even some supernatural stuff. So if you watch it, what kind of horror experience will it be for you? And what about that deeper meaning that some people mention? What is that? Maybe it's about grief and trauma turning into something scary.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's saying something about how we can't always trust what we think is real. It definitely makes you think about what you find interesting in horror movies.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's what we're all about here, getting you thinking.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And